All right, picture this. It's April 1945. We're in the final, absolutely chaotic weeks of World War II in Europe. Entire cities are collapsing, a whole regime is just crumbling to dust. And for the very first time, pioneering camera crews are right there in the middle of it. But they're not just capturing it in black and white. No, they're filming it all in vivid, shocking color.
You know, that line, it wasn't from some Hollywood movie script. That was a personal note from the director George Stevens, a man who was actually tasked with filming the war. I mean, this guy had already seen the liberation of Paris, he'd filmed the Battle of the Bulge, but he was about to see something so horrific that even his battle-hardened eyes could barely process it. This quote, it really sets the tone for what he and his color cameras were about to show the world.
So, American troops had fought their way all the way to the Elbe River. They even named their new bridge the Gateway to Berlin. But here's the thing. Berlin wasn't their target. Not anymore. Stalin's Red Army was already slugging it out street by bloody street for the capital. So the mission changed. The American forces and the filmmakers embedded with them got new orders. Turn south and march right into the collapsing heart of the Third Reich.
And the team doing the filming? That's what makes this so unique. Special Film Project 186 wasn't your standard military unit. It had incredible talent like George Stevens, and they were using this brand new 16mm color film. This new technology gave their footage what was described as an oppressive authenticity. Suddenly, the war wasn't some grainy, distant event. It was immediate. It was right in your face. It was both magical and absolutely terrifying. From there, our story moves to Nuremberg. And you have to understand, Nuremberg was more than just a city. It was the symbolic, beating heart of the Nazi Party. It was the site of all those massive, infamous rallies. Hitler himself had ordered it defended to the very last man. And in April 1945, a brutal, final battle for its streets was coming to a close. When the city finally fell on April 20th, and here's the cruel irony, that was Hitler's 56th birthday, an estimated 90% of Nuremberg was just gone. Total ruin. It wasn't just defeated, it was annihilated. We're talking over 8,000 people killed in bombing raids alone, and the street fighting just finished the job.
The change was just absolute. I mean, before the battle, Nuremberg was this grand stage for Hitler's speeches, for the Nazi rallies. And after, it was a silent ruin, a landscape of rubble. There was no light, no electricity, almost no water. The ideological stage had literally become a graveyard.
A journalist named Franz Nardler, who was there at the time, he captured the human cost in his diary. He wrote, "Nuremberg is dead. There are no coffins for the dead, no hearses to collect them." Think about that. It wasn't just about the buildings being destroyed. It was the complete breakdown of society, right down to its most basic final rituals. And the American occupation brought in new rules, and they were immediate and they were harsh. A strict curfew. If you were caught outside without a permit, you were to be shot. A strict policy of non-fraternation meant no personal contact between GIs and German civilians. And all women between 15 and 50, they were ordered to report for duty, clearing rubble. The shift in power was absolute, and it happened in an instant. So while some camera crews were filming the physical destruction of cities, like Nuremberg, director George Stevens and his team were sent south on a totally new assignment. They were about to come face to face with a different kind of destruction, one that was so much deeper and way, way more disturbing. Just pause and think about that question for a second. What could make a battle-hardened soldier weep? I mean, these are men who stormed beaches, they've fought through frozen forests, they've seen their buddies die. They're hardened to the sight of death. So what on earth could be so shocking, so completely beyond the pale, that it could bring a combat officer to tears? The answer was Dachau. On April 29th, American troops walked into the first concentration camp ever built in Germany, and inside they found over 30,000 prisoners and a level of horror that just defied words. The very first thing they saw was a train packed with the bodies of inmates who had starved to death, frozen to death, or been shot. A survivor, a man named Edgar Cooper Koberwitz, he actually wrote down what he saw in his diary. He saw an American officer look at the bodies of inmates who had died of starvation and exhaustion, and the officer just broke down and started to weep. Cooper Koberwitz wrote, "The sight is so shocking that even the tears of a warrior are understandable." The horror of Dachau was a horror beyond the known scope of war. And what about the men responsible for all this? The perpetrators? Well, when George Stevens' team filmed the captured SS guards, their defense was chillingly simple. They claimed they were just insignificant underlings. They were only obeying orders.
At the same time, in Munich, the city known as the capital of the Nazi movement, the entire regime was just collapsing in on itself. This is where Hitler's political career had started, and by April 30th, the day American troops marched in, the symbols of that regime were finally coming down for good.
You can really break down the end of the ideology into 3 key moments. First, the Nazi Party headquarters, the famous Brown House, was nothing but a bombed-out ruin. Second, the news finally arrived. Their leader, Adolf Hitler, had killed himself in his Berlin bunker. And third, the ultimate symbols of their power, all those swastika flags, they were now literally just garbage being swept up in the streets. A journalist in Munich, Ruth Andreas Friedrich, she just perfectly captured the mood of the people. She wrote, "Hitler is dead, and we all behave as if it did not concern us. Go to hell, Führer, you don't interest us anymore." There wasn't some grand mourning. It was just this pragmatic, sudden detachment from the man they had followed into total ruin.
And then the color cameras captured something truly surreal. While former inmates were still dying from starvation and disease in Dachau, just a few miles outside the city, George Stevens' crew filmed the people of Munich sunbathing by the river. It's this incredibly jarring image of a society so desperate to get back to normal, to move on from a horror it hadn't even begun to process. Okay, so the major cities are taken, the leader is dead. You'd think the war was pretty much over, right? But Allied commanders, especially General Eisenhower, they still had this one major fear. A fear that had been fueled for years by Nazi propaganda. They were terrified of the Alpine Fortress. This was a rumored, heavily fortified stronghold, supposedly hidden deep in the mountains of Bavaria. And the fear was that the Nazi elite had all retreated there to make one final, bloody last stand. The thinking was, it could drag the war on for another entire year through brutal guerrilla fighting. General Omar Bradley even told a delegation from Washington the war might last another year because of it. But the fortress was a ghost. It was a complete propaganda lie. When the troops and the camera crews finally pushed deep into the Alps, they found nothing. No fortifications, no elite SS units ready for a fight to the death. All they found were these idyllic little mountain villages, surrendering soldiers, and Hitler's personal mountain retreat, the Berghof, which had already been bombed into rubble. In those last days of the war, the author Erich Kästner was observing the psychology of his defeated countrymen, and he wrote that everyone was blaming someone else, but excluding just one person from this blame, themselves. He concluded they would rather be thought of as a complete idiot than as a scoundrel. That's such a powerful insight into the first stirrings of denial and just how hard it is to confront national guilt. And so, the fighting was over. The regime was destroyed. The color film had captured the ruin, the horror, all of it. But as the dust finally began to settle, a much, much more difficult question emerged. It was one that soldiers and cameras couldn't answer. The war was over, but how does an entire society awaken from a nightmare?